And we are live here on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. What is good, guys? Nick Script live on the P2W Fantasy Podcast, heading into Week 13. We are getting so close to the fantasy playoffs. These weeks are more important than ever. We have a good show looking at some matchups today. As always, this podcast is partnered up with the Fantasy Points Media Group, a branch of fantasypoints.com. Stick with me. It's going to be a great show.
To win, no fear to give. I feel but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best on trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win, oh, play to win. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win.
Okay, so we have a matchups show for you guys today, looking at Week 13. So the purpose of this show is to outline matchups to identify what defenses are allowing what to specific positions, then outline the players who can capitalize in that specific position for fantasy. This, again, can help fantasy, but also might be able to help you guys who play DFS to figure out those good plus matchups. The points allowed data comes from fantasypoints.com, one-stop shop. Like I always say, for everything fantasy football, you are looking for articles, media content, advanced research, rankings, projections, an awesome Discord. Use the promo code P2W22 for a discount. So let's get into our first matchup of the slate, which is going to be tomorrow's game, Thursday's game, the Bills versus the Patriots. So the Patriots rank 17 or worse for fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, running backs, and wide receivers. They allow the least running back points per game to running backs this season. Devin Singletary's had 6 games under 10 fantasy points this year, with 3 of those being across his last 5 games. The only plus fantasy matchup versus the Patriots is for the tight end position. The Patriots give up the 8th most points per game to tight ends. Dawson Knox scored 14 fantasy points in Week 11. This was only his second time, though, above 10 fantasy points. After seeing 6, then 7 targets in Weeks 10 and 11, he saw 2 last week. So there's either a chance that he continues to score under 10 fantasy points or that Buffalo attempts to use a position New England has not been the best at defending. On the flip side here, the Bills are ranked 19th or worse in fantasy points allowed to all of quarterbacks, running backs, tight ends, but give up the 8th most points per game to wide receivers on the year. Jacoby Myers only played 29% of the snaps in Week 12 due to a shoulder injury, but he expects to play in Week 13. Myers averages 6.8 targets per game with 2 games of 13 targets on the season. After averaging only 51 receiving yards in 2021, which is something I didn't like about him, he is up that this season to 63.4 yards per game. Through 9 games, Jacoby averages 13.4 fantasy points per game with 3 weeks above this. The one wide receiver you can actually trust for the Patriots. Next matchup to look through here is the Packers versus the Bears. And as a Bears fan, this is always one we look forward to. But as of Wednesday, we are not sure what sort of combination of like Justin Fields or Trevor Siemian or Nathan Peterman on one side we're going to have versus the other side of Aaron Rodgers or Jordan Love for Week 13. It would have been nice to have a perfectly healthy Fields versus a perfectly healthy Aaron Rodgers, but we're not sure how it's going to look. But Green Bay is outside the top 20 in fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends, but give up the 7th most points per game to running backs. David Montgomery has scored 21.1 and 14.3 fantasy points the last 2 weeks with 3 catches in each of those games, along with 67 and 79 rushing yards. He saw 80% and 68% of the snaps versus the Atlanta Falcons and the New York Jets. The game might be scripted in a sense that they try to win this game or at least make it a game on the ground. And that could be said for both sides here, just not knowing what the quarterback situation is going to actually look like. On the flip side, Chicago is 1 spot more generous than Green Bay in fantasy points allowed to running backs at number 6, so the 6th most. A matchup statistic I've been referencing all season long. Aaron Jones is the running back 7 overall in the season, averaging 16 points per game. He has been above this average 5 times a season, is 5th in running back receptions and 7th in rushing yards for running backs. pay attention because I feel like he popped up on the injury report. It's kind of early, but if he's good to go, it's a really nice matchup. A.J. Dillon scored 17.8 fantasy points last week, just the second time he's been above 10 fantasy points this year, with that last time being week 1. So situational week 13 can be in his favor, but obviously with major risks, just seeing what he's done all season, A.J. Dillon. Next matchup, we have the Steelers versus the Falcons. Atlanta is a top 10 matchup in terms of fantasy points per game allowed across the board. The Falcons allow the 5th most points per game to wide receivers. Rookie George Pickens has seen 12 targets across his last 2 games. He's had 3 straight games above 10 fantasy points. He averages 10 fantasy points per game, but he's been above this mark 5 times. Deontay Johnson, just as a little comparison here, is just 0.1 points per game ahead of rookie George Pickens. The big play potential for Pickens is there through him being ranked number 5 in the average depth of his targets, number 6 in deep targets, and inside the top 20 for the wide receiver position in air yards. Pittsburgh gives up the 7th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the most points per game to wide receivers. Marcus Mariota only averages 23 passing attempts per game. He is, however, the QB10 overall, averaging 16.18 fantasy points per game. His floor is safer due to his legs, with him being a top 5 quarterback in carries and rushing touchdowns, and he's number 6 for quarterbacks in total rushing yards. He's only 46% rostered on Sleeper as of earlier today. He'd be a solid streamer for Week 13 if you were looking for one for the quarterback position. Have the Jets versus the Vikings. Minnesota is a top 12 fantasy matchup in points per game allowed to all of quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. Garrett Wilson is coming off of a 2-touchdown game. There was an injury on one of those touchdown plays to the safety, Eddie Jackson, and maybe he would have prevented that play. But I feel like the thing that stands out here is being targeted 8 times by Mike White, who was super efficient in this one. He was throwing 22 for 28, 315 passing yards, and 3 touchdowns. Mike White is only 18% rostered, and 3 out of 4 of Garrett Wilson's last games have been above 16 fantasy points. The New York Jets are 17th or worse in fantasy points allowed to all of quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. They're the most giving to tight ends for fantasy. So let's talk about the Minnesota tight ends. So since TJ Hawkinson's move from Detroit to Minnesota, he is ranked for the tight end position weeks 9 through 12, number 2 in targets behind Kelsey by 8 targets, but ahead of the 3rd place tight end by 11 targets. Number 2 in receiving yards, number 3 in fantasy points, 12.8 fantasy points per game, with 2 of those weeks above 15 fantasy points. So TJ Hawkinson has been solid, and it's a decent matchup, just comparing the matchup for tight ends versus the other positions when it comes to the Jets. Next game on the slate here, we have the Jaguars versus the Lions. Detroit is a top 4 fantasy matchup to all of quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends. The number 1 fantasy matchup to quarterbacks. Across the last 2 games played, Trevor Lawrence has been great for fantasy, scoring 20.96 and 22.94 fantasy points. He has scored over 20 fantasy points just 4 times this season. So seeing 2 of those 4 games in back-to-back weeks is a good sign potentially the rest of the season, or at least against the best fantasy matchup for quarterbacks. He's passed the ball 40 and 37 times in these last 2 games, 259 and 321 passing yards, 2 out of 2 and 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games. So Lawrence is taking stride right now, and it's a great matchup, the best matchup for fantasy. Jacksonville is a top 12 matchup in points per game allowed to quarterbacks and tight ends, and just outside of this for wide receivers, being the 13th best matchup. Jared Goff is coming off of a 17.6 fantasy point week. He opened up the season well with 26.04 week 2 and 34.22 week 4. He's currently rostered in 48% of sleeper redraft leagues. After only seeing 17% of the snaps in week 7 due to the concussion protocol, weeks 8 through 12 Amon-Ra St. Brown is ranked 5th in targets, 6th in receiving yards, and 6th in total fantasy points for the wide receiver position. Over 22 fantasy points in 2 out of 3 of these last games. Next on the list here, we have the Titans versus the Eagles. So Philly is a rougher matchup to all of quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends. 24 plus ranked for all of those, and the worst is for the quarterback matchup for fantasy. The 1 plus is the running back matchup. They give up the 8th most fantasy points per game to the position, aka it should be a feed the beast, feed Derrick Henry day for the Titans. Henry is at 4 games of 28 plus carries. He already has, through 12 weeks, a career high 21 receptions. Number 2 in rushing yards with over 1,000 already. Top 10 in receiving yards, surprisingly, for the running back position. 10 total touchdowns on the year. Other side of the ball, the Titans give up the 6th most fantasy points per game to running backs. Tougher matchup at 25th to running backs. To quarterback, I got that a little bit twisted there. But 2nd most to wide receivers and 13th most points per game to tight ends. So we'll focus on the wide receiver position there. 2nd most to wide receivers. 3 straight games for A.J. Brown under 12 fantasy points. He's averaged 15.8, which is boosted by games of 25.5 and 39.6 scoring for the season. The upside is obviously there. 2 games of 155, 156 receiving yards. He's had a 3-touchdown game this season. I will be curious to see if Jalen Hurts in a quarterback-friendly matchup can get A.J. Brown going in a plus wide receiver matchup. So, again, the Titans give up the 6th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, 2nd most to wide receivers. Can Jalen Hurts get A.J. Brown going after some down weeks? Next, we have the Browns versus the Texans. The Texans are surprisingly a rough matchup through the air, ranking 30th and 28th for points per game allowed to quarterbacks and wide receivers. All eyes are going to be on Deshaun Watson in his first start following suspension in Cleveland against his former team. This is a quarterback, though, we've seen be a top 5 fantasy quarterback for multiple years across 2018 through 2020. The Texans are the number 1 fantasy matchup for running backs, though, so all eyes might be on Watson, but they actually might end up being on the back of Nick Chubb's jersey. Chubb's averaging 18.9 fantasy points per game, number 3 for running backs and rushing yards, over 1,000 yards on the ground already. Number 2 in total touchdowns with 12 for running backs, number 1 in evaded tackles. Guy's been a beast this season, and it's the best matchup for running backs. So while we might think that Deshaun Watson's going to want to come out and throw for 8 touchdowns, it's probably going to be a Nick Chubb day. The Browns are not super fantasy friendly to any position, but the running back. Houston in general is one of the bottom scoring offenses who just turned to Kyle Allen as their 2nd string quarterback, is now the starter. Giving up the 2nd most fantasy points per game to running backs, though, makes you think about Dameon Pierce in a potential bounce back. Pierce has had back-to-back weeks under 5 fantasy points. He saw his lowest amount of touches with 8 last week. He hasn't scored 15 fantasy points since week 7. We've seen some high-volume days, though, for Pierce with 5 games of 20-plus touches, and he's had better fantasy days with 2 games above 20 fantasy points. If there is a week for Dameon Pierce to bounce back, this would be the matchup to do it. Commanders versus the Giants. So the Giants are the 16th or worse fantasy matchup in points per game to all but the tight end position. They give up the 6th most points per game to tight ends, but their primary tight end, Logan Thomas, is dealing with rib issues still. I will say, though, this stat, and again, maybe not the best matchup, but since Taylor Heineke has been the starter through starting in week 7, Terry McLaurin has had games of 18.3, 16.6, and 20.8 fantasy points. Back-to-back weeks under 10 fantasy points, but at least we've seen decent days with the quarterback that didn't open the season as a starter. 15th or lower in points per game allowed to all positions from the Commanders, so a tough fantasy matchup. I'll be curious to see if, again, Richie James or Darius Slayton two guys that are not rostered in a ton of leagues. If one of them can step up and be a decent flex play, both have been decent flex plays the last few weeks, especially seeing Wan'Dale Robinson, a guy that they probably were going to lean on for targets, out of the picture, unfortunately, with that ACL. I prefer out of the two, though, Darius Slayton, just because we've seen pretty consistently some receiving yard upside. So if he can see some decent volume, I think he's the guy that can take one or two good plays to give you 12 to 14 fantasy points. And when you're looking for a desperation flex, sometimes that's plenty. Next, we have the Broncos versus the Ravens. The Ravens are a top 12 matchup for quarterbacks and wide receivers. I'll be curious to see if Jerry Jeudy plays. He did not practice on Wednesday, but there's time for changes to be made there. Sutton has been pretty underwhelming. In Judy's last two games played, he scored 16.6 and 18.3 fantasy points, seeing 18 targets across those last two games played. So I may be wasting my time talking about him, but he's a guy I'm anxiously awaiting to be back just because he was solid for fantasy his last two games played. Pay attention to the injury news. It's a good matchup for Russell Wilson, but the last time he scored 15 fantasy points or more was week 4 against the Las Vegas Raiders. So even in decent matchups, I find it hard to trust Wilson. This is a team you are going to have to pay attention to when it comes to the Ravens. I think Lamar Jackson just popped up on the injury report. I saw in the sleeper app that J.K. Dobbins has a projection for the week, meaning there's a chance that he plays. Maybe he doesn't suit up. If not, if J.K. Dobbins is out of the mix, last week Gus Edwards returned to action. He led the way with 16 carries. Kenyon Drake and Justice Hill didn't really get much. So it could be the sort of game that maybe Lamar plays but is limited. Maybe he plays but he's 100%. Maybe he doesn't play. But we just saw Gus Edwards touch the ball 16 times. So if there is no Dobbins, I feel like he can be a guy if you're really desperate for a running back, even in a tougher matchup, that can see some work here. Dolphins versus the 49ers. So the 49ers allow the 16th or less most points per game to fantasy positions. So 16 to 32. They're a tougher matchup. Tua may have his hands full, but since returning in week 7 from that concussion, he's had 3 weeks of 3 passing touchdowns in his 5 appearances, showing true upside for the quarterback position in that system. Dolphins are a great matchup for quarterbacks, allowing the 3rd most points per game. They are also a plus matchup for tight ends, allowing the 3rd most points per game as well. Kittle has seemed to be boom or bust, but if they can be exploited using the tight end position, this might be a bounce back for George Kittle that we just saw score 24.4 fantasy points in week 11 as the tight end to that week. He had 84 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns in that specific game. Seahawks versus the Rams. So outside of the top 20 for points allowed to quarterbacks, running backs, and tight ends, but oddly enough, the Rams give up the 9th most points per game to wide receivers. DK Metcalf's usage has been solid across the last 4 weeks. 10, 6, 9, and 15 targets, at least 13 fantasy points in these last 4 games, with 2 of them above the 20 mark. Tyler Lockett hasn't had the highest of targets during this span that I'm referring to, but he does have more total fantasy points this year than DK Metcalf. He's the wide receiver 13. DK Metcalf is the wide receiver 18. Lockett averages 14.5 points per game. DK 13.3. Nobody had both of these guys ranked inside their top 20 that I've seen across the board from analysts. So in, a season that we didn't know if it was going to be Drew Lock or Geno Smith, I think a lot of people actually thought it was Drew Lock. The fact that it was Geno Smith and that he's been a baller this year has been great for the stocks of both DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. And again, in a matchup where the Rams give up the 9th most points per game to wide receivers, that's good for them. Seattle is a top 12 matchup to all of quarterbacks, running backs, and tight ends, but a tougher matchup to wide receivers for fantasy. They're actually within the top 3 for running backs and tight ends. So, again, top 12 for quarterbacks, running backs, and tight ends, top 3 for running backs and tight ends. Tyler Higbee did not see a target last week from Bryce Perkins, who is probably going to be a starter again in place of Matthew Stafford. Some believe this is due to him having this blocking role and having to do that and focus on that. I tend to think that it was because of that knee. He had this knee swelling that was reported, and I think he was like limited through the week. I truly think that played a factor because this season he's been the 4th most targeted tight end. It's a good matchup. I'm going to cross my fingers that he's healthy and that he can see some decent volume in this game in a good matchup for the tight end position. Kyren Williams, the rookie, led the Rams in touches with 14 and played 70% of the snaps in week 12, with everyone focused on guys like Zonovan Knight and JaMychal Hasty and like Benny Snell or Jalen Warren off the waiver wire. I would have been checking on Kyren because I feel like if everybody's healthy in those systems, the one guy that stands out as the actual starter to me is Kyren Williams. He had 14 touches, I believe, 70% of the snaps. And if he gets another 15 to 18 touches, I feel like this could be a useful week, just seeing again that they're a top 3 matchup for running backs, the Rams or the Seahawks. Next game on the slate, we have the Chargers versus the Raiders. Las Vegas gives up the 2nd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, the 4th to running backs, the 12th to wide receivers, and the 7th to tight ends. To me, it just screams whatever Charger you have, play them. Play the pass catchers. Justin Herbert has thrown the ball 30 and 47 times the last 2 games for over 270 passing yards in both, with a total of 5 touchdowns. Good volume to go around. Eckler is your obvious star. Keenan Allen looks healthy and should play more of the snaps. Gerald Everett has done good things for the tight end position this season. He's getting more healthy. I know DeAndre Carter had a good week in week 12, but flex Joshua Palmer if you have him. Super fantasy-friendly system, especially this week. The Chargers are the 13th or better, meaning closer to 1 matchup for points allowed to all positions outside of wide receivers. Josh Jacobs and Devonta Adams are your obvious starts. Jacobs just went crazy, 39 touches. He had close to 50 fantasy points. Now he gets a top 5 running back matchup versus the Chargers. Adams is a matchup-proof wide receiver. Maybe he's not always carb-proof, but he's consistently seen high target volume. He leads all wide receivers in targets for the season. 7 targets for Foster Moreau last week. It's a top 12 fantasy tight end matchup here. So if you're looking for a stream, he is a tight end to consider with Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow on the IR. 2 of his last 3 games, Moreau has scored over 12 fantasy points, which doesn't seem like a lot, but for the tight end position, it actually is. We got the Chiefs versus the Bengals. So the generic term shootout gets tossed around a ton, but if there is one to talk about, it's got to be Patrick Mahomes versus Joe Burrow. The Bengals D are in the 20s when looking at points allowed to quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and they give up the 16th most points per game to tight ends. Travis Kelce is in his own tier for the tight end position right now, looking at targets and receiving yards. Juju and Tony were sidelined Wednesday, so pay attention to that news for the potential of somebody else to have to step up. Isaiah Pacheco had a season-high 15-ish fantasy points with decent volume in Week 12. But if this game gets focused through the air, I feel like it'll be a Jerick McKinnon sort of day. So it really depends on how the game script and the game flow goes. If most of it's going to have to be through the air because of these 2 quarterbacks and this matchup, then again, I think it favors Jerick McKinnon just because he's been utilized to a decent level in those sort of games. The Chiefs are a top 10 matchup to quarterbacks and wide receivers. Jamar Chase is set to return, it looks like, from his hip injury. reports suggested in week 12 that he probably could have played, but I feel like being cautious in week 12 and having him, closer to 100% than coming off of a game where he might have been banged up, it might have been the smart move for Jamar Chase. You're obviously playing T. Higgins. Burrow has thrown the ball 39 and 37 times the last 2 games. Season high has been 53 this season. He's had 1 game in the 40s. It could end up being, if the volume is there, a sneaky Tyler Boyd day, who has been disappointing with Chase out, but he's also had 2 games this season over 20 fantasy points. Then we have the Colts versus the Cowboys. So Dallas is not inside the top 20 in points per game allowed to any position. Micah Parsons and them boys are rough for a matchup. And I feel corny saying that line. But one player I'm looking to see if he can make an impact in this game is going to be Paris Campbell. Down week in week 12, but with Matt Ryan, he's had games of 18.7, 23, 20.6, and 11.7 fantasy points. He's been in flex territory in those games, and he probably will continue to be in that. There's just risk when it comes to a matchup like this. But he's obviously not the focus of a defense with the likes of Jonathan Taylor and Michael Pittman out there. Indianapolis is not the most fantasy-friendly matchup either to any specific position. They are actually the worst fantasy matchup for wide receivers. 2 out of 3 of Dalton Schultz's last games, he scored a touchdown, and he's had over 17 fantasy points. The targets have trended down from 8 to 5 to 4 the last 3 games. But knowing it's a tougher matchup for wide receivers, I feel like Dak might lean more on Schultz in this matchup versus the Colts. So the last game is the Saints versus the Bucks. Not going to go into that one just because it's the Monday night game, and I'll probably do something separate for that. But make sure, if you are seeing this, to shoot me a follow on Twitter if you are not already, because I'm answering start and sit questions on there on a daily basis, and I drop a ton of content, different types of content. So let's see. I got a couple questions here to run through quick. Please start to Jimmy G, Christian Kirk, Geno, Tua, and Deshaun Watson. So I feel like you got to start Tua just in most matchups. I feel like, I'm not going to say he's matchup proof, but I'm saying that his system of that playbook, the accuracy with his arm, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, I feel like it's a good system that I don't fear matchups. So I feel like just seeing, these games, I talked about it earlier, of 3 passing touchdowns consecutively. I think he went like 3 weeks of that recently. I feel like you got to play Tua. Watson, again, has been a top 5 guy. It's just risky because he hasn't played football in a long time. I think, Geno Smith's been great this season. I think Tua and Geno are your plays. I mean, unless you want to shoot for the stars with Deshaun Watson, I feel like that game is going to be more of a Nick Chubb game, though. Jimmy G is the safest play of this group. I'm going to go Tua and Geno in this one. My guy, Chris Tejada, give me your World Cup picks. You gotta want USA to win, of course, but I think they lost today, or they're coming off of a loss. But I feel like France is the most dangerous team. I think Brazil is very dangerous as well. 2 teams that got guys with a lot of flair and a lot of speed. I think it's going to be one of those 2 teams. Let's see. Should I trade Dalvin Cook and Christian Watson for CD and Thielen? Really dependent on the depth of the running back position. I'd say no right now, actually, just because, if it's dynasty, if this is a dynasty question, then yes, because I feel like CD Lamb is well above everybody in this trade for me in dynasty. In redraft, Thielen is the 3rd option. I know he had a big day for the Vikings last week, but since TJ Hawkinson has been there, Thielen is the 3rd option in the passing game. Dalvin Cook hasn't exactly lit the world on fire. We know that he can. He's had some pretty big weeks this year. Christian Watson is red hot right now, so I feel like if I'm super deep at running back, maybe, but I feel like, the running back position is pretty thin. I feel like I'd want, instead of Thielen on that side, I'd ask for another running back that doesn't cost the world, like a Jeff Wilson or something along those lines. How would you rank these running back stashes? TDP, so that's Tyrion Davis-Price, Warren, Zamir White, JaMychal Hasty. Out of this group right now, I think you need to pick up Jaylen Warren because I feel like he has a true potential to be the lead back in Week 13. Najee Harris just had this abdominal issue, left the game early. Benny Snell took the lead. Benny Snell has had so many opportunities through time. He's not the guy. Jaylen Warren was out with a hamstring issue. He should be ready to go. He's been the second running back in the system. He's shown some good efficiency. I think he's had 3 games above 10 fantasy points on limited touches. So I'm going to go with Jaylen Warren just because Najee's been, and he is banged up right now. And these other guys, you might have to wait for an injury while Jaylen Warren actually is in a situation where there is one. Would you do Christian Watson and Amon-Ra for Justin Jefferson? Thinking here. That's tough because I really like Amon-Ra St. Brown. I think Amon-Ra St. Brown can also have big 20-plus point weeks. To me, Justin Jefferson is the wide receiver 1 or 2 rest of the season. Probably top 3 because I feel like it's Justin Jefferson in whatever order you want it. Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, and Stephon Diggs. So if this doesn't kill your depth, I would do it, I think. I'd do it. Amon-Ra St. Brown, love what he's doing, love the volume. I just went and traded like a shit ton of stuff to go and get Amon-Ra St. Brown. So I'm with having him on your team. But Justin Jefferson and what he can do, I still think is in a different tier. I just think so. That'll do it for the podcast, unless I get a last-minute question popping up here. But good luck in Week 13, guys. Make sure you like and subscribe this podcast wherever you consume it. Shoot me a follow on Twitter and Instagram. I'm there now as well. TikTok, I'm under the Fantasy Points, Fantasy PTS account, dropping stuff on there every day, always with the intent to help you guys play to win.